First, let's be very clear, heavier taxes on housing, because that's what changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax are, heavier taxes on housing, or they will not, I repeat, will not make housing more affordable or more available. Only people with no understanding of economics, none whatsoever, or people with an ideological set against home ownership could think that higher taxes on housing make sense, which is why the Greens and the Labor left faction are constantly pushing for them, and why people who feel locked out of the housing market might be tempted to support them, either from resentment towards anyone who works hard and gets ahead, or the general Marxist dislike of anyone owning anything when they want us all dependent on the state. But make no mistake, the only way Treasury would be modelling the impact of abolishing or limiting negative gearing and cutting the capital gains tax concession for landlords with a rental property is if someone senior in government has told them to do that. And we know how government works. I know better than most. Public servants, they don't just casually explore options that governments have previously ruled out again and again, as Labor has done, ever since Bill Shorten lost them that unlosable election on this very policy. If Treasury wasn't instructed to do this work that's now embarrassed the government that said it wouldn't move on these changes, well, then heads should roll. And they haven't, have they? Indeed, both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, when caught out by these headlines, refused to rule out changes, instead resorting to tricky language, no current plans, you've heard that before, or as we saw from the Prime Minister this morning, at his patronising best.
Will you rule out changes to negative gearing and property taxes this term or next?
Well, what we're doing is doing the legislation that we have before the Senate. So I talk about what we're doing, not what we're not doing, and what we're doing is trying to get through that legislation.
It's not unusual for the public service, and in my case, my department, I'm sure Katie's department is the same, to examine issues that are being speculated about in the public or in the parliament. That's how a good public service operates. I'm not going to engage in hypothetical impacts of hypothetical policies.
Well, we have no plans to touch or change negative gearing. What we did with our income tax changes was to deliver a tax cut for every Australian.
Yeah, but you lied doing it. You lied. You were deceptive doing that.
Guess what, Pete? Well, if I did, so did Peter Dutton, because they voted for it.
The mood's changing, isn't it? So why has Treasury been instructed to do this work, as it must have been instructed almost certainly by the Treasurer? Remember, it was Jim Chalmers who told Treasury to start modelling those changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts last year, when the Prime Minister was still insisting that Labor would not break the promise to keep them.
Stage 3 tax cuts will come into effect in July in full.
Well, we haven't changed our position on that, Michael.
I'll ask that question again. Can you promise, as you did before the election, the Stage 3 tax cuts will come in full in July?
Well, I've said we haven't changed our position,
Michael. Can you promise, Prime Minister?
I've said I can't be clearer than that.
On the Stage 3 tax cuts, are they going ahead and when?
Well, we haven't changed our position on that. We have no change to our plans. Tax cuts will happen in July. We're being very upfront with the Australian people that when economic circumstances have changed, it is the responsible thing to do to change our policy. And we are changing our policy for the right reasons.
They must think we're stupid. I mean, they were modelling those changes to Stage 3 prior to Christmas. Then he trots out all those lines and then only days later fesses up to the changes. Having rolled the Prime Minister on one tax issue, is this about the Treasurer trying to roll him on another? Because there's no doubt that Labor's looking for money to bankroll a big election spending war chest, and negative gearing on rental properties. That's thought to have cost the budget about $2 billion last year in lost revenue. Or could it be that Labor thinks that negative gearing might help them with the Greens, given that Marxist Greens are always in favour of higher taxes, particularly on private property? Perhaps these are the changes that are being worked up to in case Labor is caught in a negotiation in the event of a hung parliament with the Greens and need to do a deal. Maybe it's a little bit of all three. But what we do know is that after several days of evasion and confusion, the Prime Minister seemed to be dumping this all in the Treasurer's lap, telling the media that they'd have to direct their negative gearing questions to Chalmers, who, very conveniently, had just slipped the country and was on his way to Beijing.
It's a fair question to ask you whether you or your Treasurer has requested this study.
Sure, and I've answered that.
You've answered it for yourself, but not for the Treasurer.
Well, I'm not the Treasurer.
But you must have said to, hey, Jim, did you ask them to do this?
No, not at all.
So sorry, you don't know whether your Treasurer has asked them to do this work or not?
Well, I don't know because I'm not the Treasurer, and the Treasurer is on his way to China as we speak.
When a left faction Prime Minister and his right faction Treasurer are at odds, as seems to be the case here, this is a government in deep, deep trouble. With all the polls pointing to a hung parliament at best, Labor figures are turning on the Prime Minister. Last week, former union boss Bill Kelty said the government was, quote, mired in mediocrity. And former New South Wales Labor Treasurer Michael Costa said that this government had, quote, failed.
It's not just Albanese. We've always known he's not strong on policy. He's been a slogan peddler for all the time I've known him. What disappoints me is the Treasurer, the Federal Treasurer. I mean, he's a bloke that did a PhD on Keating and is systematically overturning every single reform of the Hawke-Keating government. There's a Frankenstein government here, a combination of Whitlam and the worst elements of Rudd.
But it gets worse. Here's the latest from Cameron Milner, a former Queensland Labor State Secretary, Bill Shorten's Chief of Staff, and close to the fellow Queenslander Jim Chalmers. So the ultimate Labor insider, writing in the Nightly, and this was published overnight, he said, and I quote, Albanese leads the government entirely in his own likeness, timid, weak and insipid. Under Albanese, interest rates are up, electricity prices way up, and real wages are down. We have a per capita recession and only a flood of migrants has saved us from headlines saying we are in a national recession. Whether it's tone-deaf actions like endless flying on Toto 1 or seeing Taylor Swift and Katy Perry on the same weekend or listing his investment property for a huge profit in the middle of a housing crisis, Albanese's shown poor or no judgment. I'll tell you what, he goes on. Albanese criticises the extreme Greens, says Milner, but his only viable plan to remain Prime Minister will see him govern with the extreme Greens. Federal Labor is in a death spiral, he says, of its own making. I mean, this is volcanic stuff from a lifelong Labor man. Now, I can't see the caucus taking Milner's advice and rolling another Prime Minister, even though, as Milner points out, they rolled Rudd because they were concerned that he would lose after just one term. Of course, he had all those landslide seats that Albanese doesn't have. And there's not a Labor MP in the Parliament who isn't worried now. Months and months of bad polls and things getting worse. Still, given Milner's closeness to Chalmers, it's hard not to see this as the ambitious Queenslander testing the waters for a leadership bid. If not now, then perhaps after the election.